So, for those of you in the US, this is a little Thanksgiving treat from the Art Music Technology Podcast. For those of you outside, just assume that we're thankful for something. Thanks a lot for listening, and enjoy this interview with Jason Corder. Okay, today I have the great pleasure of getting to talk to somebody who I've actually bumped into in the past. I didn't realize it, but he pointed it out to me when we were having some discussions. His name's Jason Corder. He goes by a number of different names. Where I have heard of him most recently is under the name Off the Sky. But he's worked under a lot of different names. He's also got a variety of different things he does. So rather than me jabber about it, let's talk to Jason. Hey, Jason, how's it going?
Good. Thanks for having me, Darwin. I really appreciate being a part of this series. Some of my favorite nerd heroes are on this podcast series, so glad to join the crowd.
Well, that's cool. Believe me, I feel so lucky and so blessed to be able to talk to my nerd heroes too. It's really something. So, why don't we start off by having you talk a little bit about what it is you do, what your artistic endeavors look like.
Well, I guess that just depends on the season, of course. The wintertime is a lot of, spending indoors, working on video and audio projects when it's too cold to exist outside here in Denver. The summertime, typically I don't do as much. I'm outside kind of taking a break from the production. But I also work full-time as an audio director at a video game studio here called Dire Wolf. And that's, a lot of sound effects creation, music composition, delegation of, what music goes where, what sound effects go where, how many variations to create. We're making games in the mobile space as well. So that means we have to be very conscientious of download sizes and things, which, adds a bit of extra layer of complexity to the process. So, and also working here in Denver with a crew, we're called Sela, and we've been putting on shows for about a year now, trying to bring more ambient and experimental music and video to the city. So that, in a nutshell, is basically what I'm up to these days.
That's really cool. I wish that when I was in the Denver area, we would have got to hang out a little bit more. I'm going to kind of nail you, though, on a couple of things. I mean, you talk kind of a little bit about, you do some music projects. I went to your site and I saw a whole bunch of releases, and then I scrolled and there were a bunch more, and I kept on scrolling and I kept on scrolling, and I counted like on the order of 72 releases that you've done over the years, which blows the top of my head off. And I think it's important to recognize that when you talk about doing little audio and video projects, that there are things that are, I mean, this is an extensive body of work.
It's true. I think I could start by saying, well, I definitely had, ADD as a child and somehow learned to rein that in along the way. But I think that I have definitely found a certain meditative, I guess, joy in exploring sounds and creating different sounds with different software. I like to think of myself as kind of a sonic splunker. I mean, I think I spend maybe half the time exploring new plugins or gear and the combinations of the two and recording those, as well as spending a lot of time trying to find ways to kind of collage them together, in terms of making songs. But yeah, it's been this thing where I get really antsy if I'm not putting my brain onto something. And ever since a very young age, I've felt that sound, I guess it just tickled some part of my brain in a particular way much more intensely than other things. So I was the kind of kid that was always getting into trouble, always giving my parents a really hard time. So I think I just had always so much energy, and also was, the 6-year-old down in the basement at 6 a.m, playing with nuts and bolts and tearing things apart and trying to build things. So I guess trying to create like sculptures and of some kind has always been an interesting thing for my brain to try to do. So and I also spent a lot of time, I guess, as a teenager putting together music compilations, doing the whole recording off the radio and recording from one tape to the next. So I spent a lot of time organizing songs together. And I think that's one of the things that's really helped me as far as putting albums together, because I'll have folders full of endless amounts of songs or half finished songs. And one of the things I really love doing is putting those all together on a timeline and rearranging them, and sometimes chopping bits out because this one song was way too long when I created it, 5 years ago or whatever. And also, a big part of that process has been not touching things for a long period of time, which helps me go back to them and figure out ways to improve them
or just hear them with new ears. Yeah.
yeah. So
It's interesting you kind of self-identify as, or maybe you were actually diagnosed, I don't know, but self-identifying as an ADD because I was talking to a therapist recently who kind of described how people who have ADD type brain activity oftentimes become really super engaged in things. We tend to think of it as, kind of the common idea of what it is that it's like, oh, just scatterbrained or a little crazy or whatever, but that it often really exhibits itself as being like intensely driven and intensely engaged in certain things, right?
yeah. I mean, well, it's been said or I've read that we are all just a little bit autistic,
Right.
and I might be a little bit autistic actually. Who knows? Definitely somewhat savant. I suppose my creative abilities are that far out exceed my social abilities for the most part. So
Well, yeah, okay. If that's the way that it gets identified, then I think everybody I know is
okay, good. Thanks for the affirmation.
there
Everything's
you
going to be
go.
okay.
Yeah, I think we're all good. We all can help. We can all be each other's best friends then. So one of the things, the reason that I originally got in touch with you for this series is my friend Chris Sessions mentioned that he had seen you in, I think, the Made Life space in Boulder, talking about generative music creation and using Ableton Live to do that kind of thing.
Yes.
Is that a common tool set for you, or do you really just sort of like fly from tool to tool? Do you have a common toolbox, or do you just really like use something new with each project?
I have in the past 4 to 5 years created a common toolbox, if you will, a bunch of presets. As I started to realize that I needed to take breaks from working on songs, I started, but I still wanted to feel a sense of productivity. I
Hmm.
started forcing myself in this sort of research and development R&D kind of phase where I would go and put together crazy chains of plugins or build some patches in Max or Reactor and just keep a whole collection of things that I could always pull from, and also creating impulse responses as well. Before that, it typically was that every album or set of songs would have a different approach while trying to stay under, I guess, a conceptual umbrella, which was the sort of ambient, atmospheric with acoustic instruments and lots of processing kind of paradigm. So yeah, I guess I do spend a lot of time exploring, I guess, more generative ideas lately because I think I was getting a little bit bored and was reading a book on generative music and chaos theory, and was noticing that some of these MIDI plugins in Ableton had a lot of random properties, and I just started putting things together in that R&D phase and started to realize that, wow, I can get even subtle amounts of randomization would make sitting there for 100+ hours on one song so much more interesting and so much less of a drudge. And so I started exploring it more and more, and it actually made sitting there and listening to these songs more interesting and more fun, and especially when I started building these organisms, if you will, where you just have every 5 minutes a crazy blip of sound would occur while there's a whole underbed of things crawling around, and I actually come from a background of a painting. That's what I went to formal college for. So I think very visually in terms of my music, and I like to sort of think, in terms of creating these landscapes or like a forest of sounds. So the generative thing and harnessing random features has been huge in creating that sort of visual world in my head that's informed the sounds and compositions. But yeah, the class on basically the generative class that I taught was just a culmination of a lot of the really hyper nerdy stuff in Ableton, using only the built-in Ableton MIDI effects for the class. And specifically, I did not breach into the Max for Live realm because I
Sure.
know that's just a whole
Oh,
universe that
yeah.
you could have many classes on.
That's a
So yeah,
wormhole. Yeah, indeed. So,
absolutely.
what are some of the tricks that you were able to pull off using just the standard? I mean, I'm trying to think off the top of my head what would, where would generative stuff come from? And maybe I'm having trouble imagining. What kind of things were you doing that were generative in nature?
And not to follow, kind of like the course that I was teaching,
Right.
but basically, MIDI feedback loops inside of Ableton. When I
Oh,
discovered that that was a possibility
right.
intrinsically with the software, I realized, okay, so I can just play one note, and using a series of the note length device or module or whatever they call it in Ableton, two of those back to back with certain settings, you can stagger or delay notes. So I can, play one note and have it go from one track to the next, and it sort of just keeps
Mm,
looping. And if I put a velocity in there with like it turned just slightly down, so like an audio feedback would
right.
sort of go down, it
Fade
makes the
away.
velocity.
Right.
Yeah, so then I also created some, I guess, note filters or strippers or whatever that basically, using the pitch module as well as the random module, because you can set the random module to take one note in and it either accepts that note or it doesn't. And then the pitch module filters only lets only this one specific note. So those two together basically create that filter. And so I can turn that probability up to whatever I want and then just have this
Right.
crazy spread of notes just flying around. And I was really fascinated. I just yesterday, I think, Jason Greer, an artist in Berlin, was just featured on the Ableton site. And he has done a very similar thing and released an album that's completely free, more or less. And the album actually consists of tools that he's created using only the built-in Ableton MIDI plugins. And of course, he has these chains that are just ridiculous with hundreds of. I mean, it's absurd. I thought I was bad in terms of just hitting duplicate, 10 times. No, he's really outdone me by far. But what I find fascinating is just his whole idea of his release being a free set of tools and
Right.
sounds, like 1,800 some odd samples. I was really fascinated by his approach to just releases in general and his generative use of Ableton.
That's really interesting. Now you say that you have a background, that your formal background was in painting,
Yeah.
and it's interesting because having gone through some of your catalog, listening to different things, which just gorgeous, gorgeous work.
Thank you.
But additionally, I was really drawn by the artwork that accompanied the releases as well. Yeah. How much of that did you do yourself? How much of it was stuff that you collaborated or you traded with other people on, or stuff like that? Or are you kind of like hands off of visual art at this point?
Well, I studied painting in college, but ultimately ended up getting a job right out of college as a graphic artist.
Hmm.
So I did do a lot of cover artwork along the way, but it really depended on the label because there were some labels that I had a tug of war with where they had a specific direction they were trying to go
Hmm.
to, branding, I guess, if you will.
Right.
And I wasn't, fully into it. So I was trying to steer them in other ways, and that was always hard. Some labels were very much like, oh, whatever you want to do, or I would send them an idea and they would really love it. And other labels had photographers that they were already working with, or sometimes I was so inundated with trying to finish and master the music that I just didn't have time to do any artwork and
Hmm.
would just be like, please, do you have any artist or do you have any and there have been times where the artwork was so bad I really had to say something, and even had one release that was more or less just it didn't work out because
Oh
of
wow.
I just could, I've gotten somewhat picky in my old age, I guess, in terms of wanting the presentation overall to be the art to reflect the ideas within the music and the sound itself.
Right. Now, the other thing that you mentioned that is that you're the audio director at a game studio, which is I find it interesting because everybody I know that's in the game audio business is a kind of beat down by the amount of work that it is and sort of like the pressure level of working on it.
Yeah.
But B tends to be so full, so fed up with audio by the end of the day that the last thing they want to do is any music when they get home, right?
Right. Right.
How do you keep yourself fresh musically when you're working all day in a full-time job doing audio?
That is really a good question. Yeah, firstly, working in video games is not all fun and games. So it definitely has its ups and downs, and there are days where I will come home and I literally need to just be away from the computer, or at least the programs, because I am using actually Ableton in this studio here. Since I was allowed to build this studio, I chose that software for several reasons. Mainly one, because it's so much fun with Max for Live in there, and there's tons of sound design potential. But back to the point, how do I keep going after I get back? Well, again, I think it comes back to this. It's either some part of my brain that really just loves the freedom of exploration of various chains of sounds together, trying to push limits, trying to explore, how can I break this plugin? What happens if I automate every parameter on this thing, or if I duplicate this other effect like a dozen times, what's it going to sound like? What happens if I turn the sampling rate as, to 192,000 and see how everything breaks or sounds amazing? Or I guess I just have this endless pool of ideas that I want to try to explore. So even if I can't sit down, I don't have the creative moxie at the end of the day to actually finish a song, I'll still make myself do some exploring. But in terms of
Right.
finishing, oftentimes it's really helped to either for me to set my own deadlines, and having been a freelancer for so long with the website work and the graphic arts work before I got into video game audio, it really was something that I just kind of had to force myself to do, and eventually just got to where it was kind of effortless to say, okay, I'm going to finish this thing by this date, this demo for this label. And especially once a label says, oh, they want to put it out at a certain time, then I have a very specific date, and I know I have to work ahead for that. But it's not always easy. And like in the summertime, I want to go out and I want to bike, and which I found is actually been very, very good because, the last couple of years, and a bit to my chagrin, I think there were 5 releases that occurred last year, or it was like some insane amount that I didn't really want to have happen all at once, but there were different labels that had been sitting on them, some of them for like 5 years,
Mhm.
and all of a sudden out of nowhere they're all saying, okay, this month, that month, and I'm like emailing them trying to say, oh, can we push this off? But they couldn't. It was just, it had to happen just with the printers and things like that. So I got I was working 12 to 16-hour days, mastering most of the time, mastering my own work, which I've done mastering for other artists. But if you've ever mastered your own work, it's the most neurotic,
Yeah.
difficult, insane. I don't recommend it. It's totally doable, with the numbers and great software and stuff. But it's also very, very tough. And so, yeah, I definitely had to take, half this year off I've been dealing with, playing out live more in R&D, but I have not been finishing things so much this year. And I'm getting back into that where I have a collection of songs, and I'm starting the process again of putting them all together on the timeline and figuring out, making the notes, what needs to be finished. To me, I think the sense of completion is huge in terms of just feeling, a sense of place on the planet, or just feeling good as an artist, and has been a little bit kind of addictive at times. But I will say 5 releases in 1 year is insane, and
Yeah.
I don't think I think for here moving forward, it's not sustainable. I'm definitely gonna try and scale back.
Yeah. Throw the anchor out of the boat for a little bit, right?
I think just for sanity's sake, yes.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. So I am curious. One of the things I like doing in my podcast is talking to people about their backgrounds. And visual artist, musician, sound designer, mastering engineer, recording engineer, sonic
Yep.
explorer, all these things. I where do you come from? What is the background that made you into the artist that you are?
Well, there are days where I don't feel like I'm from this planet. No, but I think it's yeah, the background. It just sort of all happened along the way. I would say a lot of it has had to do with necessity to learn things in order to be more, I guess, to put food on the table easier. I mean, I did spend a lot of time freelancing and needed to learn a lot as a graphic artist. I was learning the whole Adobe suite, so that's when I got into video and even learned a little bit of web programming along the way. And and the sound thing was ultimately, so in high school I was drawing and painting a whole bunch. I when I started working as a graphic artist right out of college, I lost all interest in that. For some reason it just up and died. And so the music really took over as the source of to get the passion source, I guess, if you will. And so that's what I was finding myself doing after getting home from website creation and logo designing and all that fun, boring stuff. As far as where the energy comes from, it's hard to say. I just have to be doing something, or I'll go insane. I think. But I did spend a lot of time. I think just to touch on the background as a teenager, working with mod trackers. That's, I think, essentially where I got into working with computers and sound. Back in the Billboard screen days, pre-internet, I remember getting this program called Mod Edit, and I remember it was like pulling teeth to get this because you had to upload so many things just to get credits from these
Oh,
Billboard
right,
screens, just to
right.
be able to get to take something. And it was it took me weeks to get this program because we didn't have the internet or whatever they called it back then,
Hmm.
the dial-up, the modem.
Dial-up bulletin boards, yeah.
Had to run over to
My
a friend's
God,
house and spend
right.
about, yeah, it's a nightmare. But when I finally got Mod Edit, and we had a 386 SX at the time, which is, I think, 32 megs of RAM. It was an amazing big loud beast with an 8-bit sound card on it. And this Mod Edit worked swimmingly on this 8-bit sound card. And I remember the theme song was like House of the Rising Sun done with 8-bit terrible samples, and I remember remixing that. And what I found the most interesting was pitching things way down, or kind of abusing some of like the arpeggiation effects, and for some reason just those alien sounds, they just touched me in a way that made me want to keep listening to them. And of course the radio at the time, WRFL in Lexington, was a huge influence. There were bands like Nine Inch Nails, Bjork, Nitzer Ebb, and all other kinds of industrial and techno artists. And I was recording these shows onto tape and listening to these. I swear I wish I still had some of these tapes, and making mixes. And so I got a lot of inspiration back then from the industrial music scene. Nine Inch Nails really, I think, did it for me in terms of
Yeah.
inspiration. And I was trying to emulate a lot of those beats on this Mod Edit program. And thank God I finally saved up and got a 16-bit sound card, the Gravis Ultrasound, which
Yes.
should be in a museum at this point.
Right.
And it could have plugged my guitar into the computer. I did take a bit of piano, I guess, lessons, and really wasn't super into that. But when I heard Nirvana, I decided I have to be in a rock and roll band. I really have to be a desperate, depressed rock and roller. So I, got this terribly crappy electric guitar and would just spend hours trying to become good at power chords. I mean, I remember my fingers just hurting so bad. But what I think made it all super fun and endearing or endurable was being able to plug the guitar into the computer and record sounds and put them into, I think I was working with Scream Tracker at this time because I was really big into the demo scene and
Okay.
downloading these amazing demos from Finland, like the Future Crew, and they just blew my mind with the graphics and the animation. And I think I was watching a lot of films at the time too, which was making me very interested in putting vision with sound together.
Right.
So yeah, I think like that formative time for me was, and pissed my parents off so many times. They come in at 3 a.m. and they're like, "What are you doing?" And I'm like, "Making music on the computer." They didn't get it,
Right.
but it was always a point of contention. But now they're like, we're glad that you did that, and you were kind of rebellious, and because now I'm having a great time doing it here at Dire Wolf.
Indeed. So One of the things that I know a number of people who started off in with trackers,
Yeah.
and to a certain extent, that working mechanism gets in your blood a little bit, right? And some people never really can shake. They always look back at that as being maybe some of the most creative times of their lives, or some of them, and some of them look at it as like, maybe the way I do about like reel to reel tape. I'm glad I never have to like wrap a reel to reel tape around a spindle again.
Yeah.
It's just one of those personal things. I did it so many times, I never want to see it again. What's your feeling now about? Do you ever kind of wish you could get back into like the modern trackers? Like, what's that one?
Is it Sunvox maybe?
No,
Or
I'm
Buzz? Or maybe Renoise?
yeah,
See,
Renoise is the one I'm thinking of.
and the reason why I mention all these is because yes, I still have them and I still use them.
Yeah, they seem to be on the tip of your tongue.
Yeah, and actually, I've been using Sunvox a whole lot. It's basically free for PC and OS X, and I think it's like $5 for iOS. And you can do some really fascinating stuff in there. And admittingly, I don't use the actual traditional tracker portion of Sunvox. What I typically do with it is because it's like Max or Reactor, it has that module connect the dots sort of based system, and there are some feedback loop modules, and I just love abusing the heck out of this program and creating some really nasty sounds.
Oh, sure.
Uh, some noise makers. Essentially, you just open the thing up and it starts growling at you and
Hmm.
intimidating you. So that's kind of what I like to do.
So, how did you make the transition from trackers to like more traditional software? Because again, some of the people I know just, I mean, they kind of struggle with more linear working systems, or maybe Ableton is a little closer in some modest way, but even that tends to be a lot more linear and a
Yeah.
lot less tweaky than what you have to deal with in a mod tracker world.
Yeah, I think, well, I was working with Buzz ultimately because I didn't touch after the teenage stint with industrial experimentation on at 386SS. I went off to college, started studying painting, and then when I got back and started doing the graphic arts thing and lost all interest, had no more passion, I got into Buzz. And that really was so much fun because again, it's like Sunvox in that you have all these modules, you can connect them, wire them, chain them in whatever bizarre ways you need to get whatever demons out. But
Hmm.
and at that point, I was working on an album with that, but I was like really struggling to make a sound that I suppose I was still trying to figure out what was my sound. I was listening to a lot of Aphex Twin, a lot of different types of electronic music and techno, and going to raves at the time, and really just soaking it all in. But I think that was such an archaic thing that, as far as Buzz is concerned, it was an archaic type of process to me. And I was watching other guys use things like FL Studio or Cubase, and then I finally made the switch. And I think for the better, it actually helped open up new worlds of ideas in terms of just basically solidifying a style. Because I could have kept going with Buzz, I'm sure, but it also was very buggy and was really hard to sometimes songs just wouldn't open up after a while. It was really
Yeah.
really frustrating. So I think just moving to a more stable environment and also a UI that looked more interesting, and with FL Studio, it just was, you could make things happen faster, and I think that sense of immediacy, that quickness, really
Right.
helped me feel more affirmed. With every session, every night, I could come away thinking like, oh, I actually got a lot more done. It feels really good this way. And the same with Cubase. I started being able to like create songs faster just because of the workflow in there is a lot more. It's just a paradigm that's been perfected for such a long time, I think.
Sure. Now, it sounds like this whole range of time has been really sort of software and computer oriented.
Yeah.
Have you ever spent much time with hardware, or was computer kind of always the thing for you?
Well, it was definitely the thing for me for the longest time. And I've been branching out into working with synthesizers. Mainly, it's been a lot of acoustic instruments. Like I have a piano in my house and a vibraphone, and I like to do a lot of things with mics and field recordings as
Hmm.
well. It's for the longest time been the marriage of acoustic and DSP processing, but I got a realistic MG1 some time
Oh
ago,
yeah.
and I love this thing. It is,
It's such a beautiful sounding instrument.
Yeah, and it has that
Yeah.
saw wave polyphony, and literally every single key. I don't know how they built this thing because it's 100% analog, and you can literally just play massive chords with 10 fingers and a couple toes if need be. I mean, it really is. I've literally laid my arm down on the entire keyboard, and it's just the most gorgeous spectral sounding, monster. But of course, it was delivered to me in this gorgeous old suitcase, and it was like they just threw it off the bus and it landed in front of my house. I mean, this thing was in some sad shape, and so I got it for free, which is great. But it
Okay.
has, and the MG1 especially had that foam that kind of
All
melted
right.
onto the
Yeah.
circuit board, and I cleaned it up a little bit, but some things just don't work right, especially if the weather is funny. It actually behaves bizarrely, but the sounds that come out of it when it behaves like brokenly are really amazing and gorgeous. So I will never get rid of that ever. And I am the type of guy that wants to be very specific in what I buy. I don't want to just go out and buy a ton of gear. I've had friends that went down the rabbit hole of, purchasing tons of things, spending tons of money, and only selling them all back for half. And
Right.
so I mate for life with my synthesizers, if you will. And I just got a Korg mini log, the new
Oh yeah.
one, because I was getting fed up with my MG1, and it's similar to the MG1, only like on steroids.
Right.
And I built a couple things. I built a weird sound generator and the kit, the Thingamableep kit.
Oh yeah.
And so I do enjoy sometimes, picking up the soldering iron. I'm actually looking right now at the Field Kit by Coma, and which is, I wanted to get into modular because I know that's all the rage, but I don't necessarily want to have the atypical modular synthy sound because I can do that within the computer and more, even though of course
Right.
it's not very pretty on stage, but I usually will just hide that and have controllers anyway. But the Field Kit to me seems like a really interesting branch into the modular world for me, just because you can have microphones and contact mics, and it's got a lot of interesting like little motors that it comes with. It you can place on objects and it vibrates them, and so I'm slowly getting away from the computer into more synthesizers, but again, I'm super picky, and by the time I'm dead, I'll probably have this room full of them, but it's going to take me a while. Or I might be dead because I'm in a room full of synthesizers and never go out again.
Yeah, well, but maybe the nice thing is that when you're dead, you'll still be in going through your first pass of synthesizers, as opposed to someone like me, who synthesizers come and go in waves, and it's not always great because, like you talk about, even with that MG1, as it sort of decays right in your hands, you're there, you know it so well, but also you're kind of there to both nurse it along, but also sort of like take advantage of its decrepitude, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I think every instrument in my house has some kind of handicap. Somehow I was just like, yeah, I'm a kind of like a school for the gifted instrument, if you will. And to me, that makes them interesting, and of course people come in and they look and they're just like, is everything okay in here? Like,
You want to go to my house?
I have a guitar that actually has all the strings. No, my guitars actually do have all their strings, even though they're about 20 years old. I think they sound amazing though, with all that grit and dirt
Oh
in there,
yeah, right.
just texture.
Oh, that's funny. So, let's talk a little bit about the game design work that you do, because the way you explained it to me via email is that you kind of work on both the music side as well as the sound design, sort of like just the in-game sound stuff. Is that true, or
Yeah, although we service several companies here, we're basically a studio that works with Pokemon and Bethesda. We do one of their Elder Scrolls games. So Pokemon has actually sent us some music that a third-party composer. The games we make in-house, I compose all the music for using various Contact orchestral sample libraries and Ableton, just massive behemoths of MIDI notes and CC data. The usual sort of MIDI mock-up is how I approach the music. Yeah, and in the SFX, of course, I'm building as well inside of Ableton. It's been the most stable program that I've used. The previous studio used Logic, and then Pro Tools before that, and it was always having problems when you would have a project with, sometimes some scenes of the game you have to hunt. There are hundreds of sounds, and it just gets unwieldy. Or trying to go back and track down a sound that needs to be fixed. With Ableton, I can have massive amounts of sound effects composed inside of one project, and it doesn't blink an eye. As far as getting things done quickly and me not going insane, that's been huge.
Mm-hmm. How often do you find yourself tapping into like some of the oddity knowledge that you've pulled together, whether it's like making reactor patches or max patches, or pulling field recordings you did at one point? Do you find yourself tapping that for the game work a lot, or does that tend to really live in the contact sound library world?
For vocal processing, I've actually been able to use Max for Live and Reactor quite a bit. There's some really interesting pitch shifting patches for Max for Live where you can just create a chord out of whatever you send through it. And so for the demon sounds, obviously, it's been perfect. That's your classic. I'm actually 5 dudes all in one person kind of demon sound. That we've come to know and love over the years.
Yes, I am Legion, right?
Yeah, many. And so that patch is should be called the Legion patch. It's perfect, but unfortunately, not a lot. Is not as much as I would like. I'd really love to do a sci-fi game, and therefore I would be able to use so many of these crazy new block-based reactor patches that are coming out, which they sound amazing now, and I'd love to use them more. But we're basically making a type of fantasy type games. So it is a lot of Foley sounds. Not that I'm taking. We usually have to pull libraries or buy DVDs because I don't have the time to do Foley. I have done some Foley. There's actually a sound in our restroom here. Actually, when you flush the urinal, it made this loud sound, and I actually sampled that, and it worked as part of this horn. I pitched it way down, and it worked perfectly as this shofar kind of horn sound. When this one character comes out, it's so that's one of those little hidden gems. Well,
if nothing else, every time you hear that, you always think of the urinal, right?
Yeah, I tell everyone in the office so they can't escape that thought. It's like, yep, our urinal's in the game, but it sounds amazing. It doesn't really sound like a urinal, so I guess,
So I want to ask you a little bit about something. So you talk about really having been a self-learner, and maybe kind of an obsessive self-learner, which is I can really relate to that a lot. I've always felt that myself as well, and I think that for myself, I think it gave me some advantages and some disadvantages. I would like to hear your perspectives on that. Having been self-taught, where do you think that gives you a leg up on people that might have had a more formal education, and where do you think that it might actually hamper you or may have slowed you down in the past?
Gotcha. Well, I would say the benefits obviously are that I have a perspective that has not been, I don't want to say tainted. Let's just use the word shaped by, I guess, somebody else's overarching opinion, or therefore like a professor or whatever. And I loved my professors in college and painting, and did everything that they said to the T. But I feel like the freedom that I could gain, of freedom of thought and teaching myself things, was a huge benefit. Building up my own portfolio from that, I think was really huge. But it was always a problem, not basically having, I guess, formal training in sound. In the past, it had been a problem, but luckily, I think, and the way the video game and maybe many industries work, word of mouth that's how I was able to get a foot in the door ultimately. And was told in the beginning, oh, we're only going to need your help temporarily for a couple months, and which thankfully turned into a couple of years working with Lego on one of their games. And as far as the hindrances, I would say, well, I guess I just named one. Another one may have been, at least for me in particular, have been sort of like the some of the antisocial tendencies that have occurred. Where I would spend a lot more time in the office, basically researching things and figuring out how to perfect my processes to make my job go a little bit easier and smoother and better, versus just hanging out all the time. And especially in the video game industry, there's a sort of, I guess, tradition of everyone just sort of shooting each other with Nerf guns more and, goofing off a bit. And, So I think I over the years have spent more time sort of focusing in. Ultimately, I think because it made me feel good. It made me feel, gave me a sense of purpose.
In addition to doing recordings and doing this work, you're also a
Yeah.
pretty active performer, right?
Yeah, more so lately than well, it just comes and goes in phases. Yeah, but recently, this past year has been pretty good for their shows.
Have you done much overseas, or has it been mostly in the U.S.?
I would say it's been a bit of both, and I think the U.S. shows have a lot of it has happened mainly out of just because it's easier and I've known
Hmm.
people here, and so ultimately I haven't played a bunch of shows over my career. I think I because I've been spending most of my time in the studio,
In the
uh,
lab, yeah.
in experimenting and trying to sort of unleash my creatures on the planet, versus getting out there and really doing the whole hyper networking thing, and which I think a lot of artists may be better at than me. And I guess I feel very, very fortunate in that some of the labels that I've worked with have had the I guess the wherewithal or whatever to put some shows together overseas for me. Well, I just got back from Poland and Latvia. I was able to play a show over there, and that was through some roundabout through some mastering work that I'd done for a guy we both released on the same label as well. And so it's kind of random sometimes when I do get shows overseas. I was able to play a show in Montreal earlier this year, and a bunch of shows in Denver with the Sela group that I've been working with. But the first shows overseas were actually, and I don't think this is a normal case, were actually set up through a net label, which I'm sure you're familiar with the net
Yeah.
label thing.
Yeah, but normally those are so low budget that they don't
Yeah,
really provide anything.
exactly. Which is why and to this day, I'm like, how did they pull that off? Honestly, I mean, was there a trust fund involved? I really don't know. Honestly, I'm not questioning it. It was an amazing experience, and I feel super thankful. That was back when I was experimenting more in dance music and techno, which, obviously versus ambient and experimental gets artists way more shows, but,
Right.
was able to go and play a show in Amsterdam and Berlin and various other places. So to me, I like to think it's more about quality versus quantity. And I also have a weird want to have each show be somewhat different.
Hmm.
So I kind of plan things differently for each event and try to gear some of the performance to the space. Like one of the shows in Dortmund was inside of this oddball venue. So I think it's Dortmund, if I'm correct, where their train runs above ground, and we were in this station that essentially was below the track, and I set the microphone outside, and I was just going to try to pick up field sounds. All of a sudden when I started playing, this train goes by. I had no idea that was going to happen, so that was a really wonderful, happy accident and everybody in the crowd was like, "Oh my gosh, did you plan that?" Of course, I'm like, "No, I think I got lucky. Like everything, like these shows, I just got lucky in some ways." So yeah, I'd say about half and half overseas and half here in the States.
It's interesting. I was just curious because the music fears that I heard, I mean, it actually to me, it has a lot of alignment with like some of the kind of things you hear, especially out of like Northern Europe and stuff, kind of very still, but also somehow like really tied to nature.
Yeah.
And, it sounds like that's something that actually is very specifically something that you kind of consider part of your voice.
Yeah, I think I might be a closet pantheist in some way, but
Yeah.
this sort of idea is how I kind of express, through the music, trying to reflect things that I've seen in nature and feelings that I've gotten just walking through the mountains in Kentucky where I grew up. It was especially influential. The hills there are just rife with life most of the time. So green, that place, at least compared to here in Colorado. And there's the Appalachian Range. If I could get a little esoteric, I might think there's a bit of vibration occurring, on a sort
Hmm.
of sub level under the earth, as that is was at one point a super active range. I mean, if it ever were to go off, it'd destroy this side of the world.
Right.
So yeah, I do feel like I want to try and pull from nature as much as I can as an inspiration.
Unfortunately, we're kind of running out of time, which is, I have so many other things I'd love to talk to you about, particularly about your ability to pull off as many releases as you do and all that stuff. But one of the things that is really important for me to know is where are you headed? You talk about kind of like slowing down your release process a little bit, but it also sounds like you're still very much a person who wants to be out exploring the edges of sound and the edges of technology and stuff like that, what are the things that are kind of in your bonnet right now, and where do you see that taking you?
That's a tough question. So many things, so many places. There's a million ideas that I have that would love to execute before I go back into outer space from whence I came, I guess. But I think immediately I'm definitely wanting to get back into building things, pick up that soldering iron and inhale those amazing carcinogenic fumes that I love, and build a field kit, probably go down the modular road like everybody else. But I do find there's something sort of beautiful and tactile about touching those knobs and connecting things. But I want to start with the field kit, and I think to me that's I've been a plug-in junkie for so long, but the modular world is so vast, and so it's all new to me. And also I'd like to get back into filming again and working on more videos, getting back out into nature and shooting footage and making soundtracks to those films. I think that to me would be the ultimate goal. But beyond that, I have absolutely no idea. It's a mystery, as is life.
Yeah, I hear you. Man, I want to thank you so much for taking the time. This has been a fabulous discussion, and you've got me kind of inspired. I'm anxious to get back to my gear and make some music, because I
Awesome.
love when these discussions take me there. That's really great.
Awesome. Thank you for
Um,
having
yeah, it was great, and I look forward to the next time we get a chance to meet. I'll make sure that I'm paying more attention.
me. No problem. Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. Well, have a good evening. Thanks so
All
much.
right. Take
Bye.
care, Darwin.
That was really a lot of fun. I love talking to Jason, and turns out we've talked before, hung out before. I need to pay a little more attention to people around me. Thank you so much to Jason for hanging out and talking. You should check his work out at offthesky.com. It's really an amazing body of work. It's worth listening to. Also, if you happen to see him playing in your town, check it out. I want to thank you to listeners for hanging out. I hope you enjoyed this little Thanksgiving special, and keep your eye out. Pretty soon we're going to be doing a little Kickstarter to help the podcast, so pay attention when that pops off. Please help us out. Other than that, I'm going to let you go. Have a great weekend, and talk to you soon. Bye.